we had this little allegory of these barges floating down a river trying to avoid the shoals of modernity on the one side and, of course, the horrible, unforgivable movement to a pre-modern world. But now turn to the page number 342 in Allen's article, because what he begins to do here is to list several pillars of the Enlightenment secular world, the modern secular world, that are beginning to collapse today, that are beginning to crumble. The second half of page 342, there are at least four areas in which this postmodern breakdown becomes evident. The most fundamental is the recognition that we can no longer claim, philosophically and scientifically, that we live in a self-contained universe. The most obvious sign of the breakdown of the modern world is the collapse of the box, the closed box, that gets along without any interference from the divine, that doesn't depend upon the divine for its existence. Now let me comment a little bit on this. This is something that Allen surprisingly doesn't mention. One of the most obvious signs of the breakdown of scientism and naturalism is the rise to prominence of New Age thinking in the world. New Age thinking. Do you realize that nowhere in Allen's article does he even mention New Age thinking? Now, what is this but a total repudiation of the assumptions of the modern age? Shirley MacLaine, with her belief in reincarnation, and her belief that she is really God, and that each of us is really God, and all of the other assorted forms that New Age thinking takes. This is a total repudiation. But of course, this is not really new either, is it? This is something that could actually have occurred during the early years of the Romantic Revolution. All those people would have needed, I mean, what's fundamental in New Age thinking is a repudiation not only of a closed, self-sufficient universe, but what's also basic to New Age thinking is a total repudiation of reason. Total repudiation of reason. Instead of it being either or, black or white, it's both and. That everything becomes relative. Truth becomes relative. This is really a return to Romanticism. If only those guys had combined some of their romantic irrationalism with some of the Far Eastern ideas that some of the New Age people have picked up, we could have had the New Age movement during the 19th century. We had some movements that were very close to it. So here's the first sign, the breakdown of the belief that we live in a self-contained universe. Why does Allen not talk about New Age as one of the signs of that? I have a theory, but I'm not sure. The second breakdown he mentions on page 344. It is the failure of the modern worldview to find a basis for morality and society. Now, I talk about this a little bit in the apologetics course. On my trips to Russia, I've lectured on this to Russian school teachers. In many ways, the worldview of post-Lenin Russia has been the postmodern, a set of postmodern presuppositions. Naturalism, rationalism, utopianism. So I talked to these Russians about the collapse of their materialism and their naturalism. And I find that we resonate with each other because they too recognize that you cannot ground an adequate view of ethics and society upon the presuppositions of the modern age. They know that, if they're Russian intellectuals. One of the major failures of intellectual thought in the last 2 centuries is the inability of that post-Enlightenment mind to give us an adequate basis for morality and society. The third pillar of the Enlightenment is belief in inevitable progress. This is, again, the bottom of page 344. But once again, I'm mystified by what Alan does here. Because before next week's class, you're going to read Kant's essay on history, in which you find his blind faith in a belief in the inevitability of progress, and then you're going to find his contemporary German thinker, Johann Herder, objecting to that and offering what really amounts to a kind of romanticist approach to history. So, this is what troubles me about Alan. You don't find the repudiation of liberal utopianism coming to the fore in 1990. You can find it in the early 1800s. You can find it in the existentialist revolt of the first half of the 20th century. Alan acts as if he has never heard of the name Karl Barth. Let's put Karl Barth's name on the board. And my mentioning Barth here certainly should never be taken as an endorsement of Barth's views. But let's just sketch Barth's little history. Barth was a German theologian who went to major German universities and theological schools, who became a pastor in Switzerland, whose mind between, say, 1910 and 1915 was totally captivated by the presuppositions of the modern world. He was a typical Protestant liberal. And then what shook Barth out of his liberal complacency? It was World War I. It was the recognition that the horrors of World War I could not possibly be synthesized with the optimism of liberal utopianism. And so Barth repudiated his old liberalism, his old modernism, and he began to look around for something else upon which he could build a theology, and he latched on to Kierkegaard. And out of that crisis in Barth's own intellectual development was born what we call the neo-orthodox movement in Protestant theology, which is not something for which Christians should rejoice, incidentally. Instead of calling it neo-orthodoxy, they should have called it neoliberalism. And then to Fuller. Fourth Enlightenment belief that's questioned, page 345, is the assumption that knowledge is inherently good. Now, this is the anti-technology kick that we have been on in the West for the last, since the late 60s. For centuries, I'm quoting here from Allen, science has been regarded as unquestionably a force for good. Today, we are becoming increasingly aware that there is no inherent connection between knowledge and its beneficial use. I'm very troubled by what Allen says here because, again, it seems too simple. Maybe in his book he gets a little bit more sophisticated, but if we were to spend more time on this, we would have to point out the extent to which the anti-technology kick grew out of the madness that characterized the West in the late 60s and the early 70s. It was It was a kind of irrational reaction to the evil uses to which technology was placed in the service of certain wars. So, see, Alan would give you if you didn't know anything else, you'd say, ooh, all of this has happened in the last 5 or 10 years. It has no roots further back in history. It has no connection to psychological aberrations like the weirdness of the New Left during the late 60s. And there are all kinds of things that were going on decades before this, and even a century before this. All right, now, the last thing that Alan says, and here too is a point that troubles me, he thinks that Christians should welcome the postmodern age with open arms. We should welcome the postmodern age, because this gives Christians new opportunities. Why? Well, it gives Christians new opportunities because, you see, the fortress of modernity is collapsing with all of its entrenched secularism and skepticism and so on. So now Christians can claim that we deserve a hearing as much as any of these other ideologies. Now, when we get to Alistair McGrath's article in a few minutes, you'll see what I think is a wise word of warning about any enthusiasm here. Because if we are in a postmodern age, and if the greater degree of relativism and openness that characterizes this postmodern age does permit the Christian to come along and say, well, why don't you give me a hearing? You're giving everybody else a hearing. We need to recognize that relativism has taken such solid root here that even if they allow us to speak, we're just one of many conflicting true ideas. It's true for you, so if you want to speak it, go ahead. But the new set of presuppositions that control the mindset of the postmodern world don't really give us access to the leaders of our culture any more than we really had in the old days of modernity. Instead of the development of the postmodern age being a source of blessing and joy and exhilaration, I think it should be a cause for a new kind of concern. Because modernity never really did rule Christianity out of court. It's just that Christians, for the most part, lack the training and the wisdom to see how best to combat those ideas among the people who saw themselves as the leaders of culture. Once again now, we need to develop a new kind of equipment, a new kind of armament, because as modernity continues to collapse, we're going to find our enemies assuming a new guise. And it may be tougher to crack this new nut, and there's a pun there, I suppose. It may be tougher to crack this new nut than it could have been if we had done our job properly during the preceding century and a half. So, you read, Alan. I think it's an introduction to the subject, but I don't think it's an adequate statement of what needs to be said. Now let's jump into the important stuff here under the heading Intellectual Pluralism, because this is where McGrath gives you his analysis of the postmodern world. He says, the intellectual foundations of this approach to pluralism, this intellectual pluralism, are associated with postmodernism, there's the word, which is generally taken to be something of a cultural sensibility without absolutes, fixed certainties, or foundations, which takes delight in pluralism and divergence, and which aims to think through the radical situatedness of all human thought. Now, underline that. Some of you said, give us a definition of postmodernism. Diogenes Allen says, I can't. Postmodernism is too vague, too vacuous, too empty of content to give you a definition. I think this is a good definition. What is postmodernism? It is a cultural sensibility without absolutes, without fixed certainties or foundations, which takes delight in pluralism and divergence, and which aims to think through the radical situatedness of all human thought. What is it to say that all human thought is characterized by situatedness or perspectivism? It means that we can get away with saying just about anything that reflects our particular perspective, and because there are no absolutes out there, no objective truth out there, no one can really prove us wrong. All ideas deserve a place in the marketplace of ideas. Let me give you a couple of examples of what postmodernism means today so that you'll see what McGrath is getting at. And some of you have heard me kick this view around in the apologetics class. Deconstructionism. There probably is no more prominent evidence of the postmodern mind today than its appearance in various forms of deconstructionism. Later in his article, McGrath gives you the names of some of the people who have helped give birth to the deconstructionist movement. He refers to Foucault, a French thinker, and Derrida, and others like that. The essence of deconstructionism in literature is the claim that it is never possible to know the meaning of any written text. It is never possible to know the meaning of any written text. Now, part of the reasoning behind that goes like this. The writer of that text produced that text from within the framework of his own subjective perspectives. You and I, as the readers of that text, come to it from totally different perspectives. It is never possible for us to enter completely into the perspective, into the world, the private world of the author of that text. Therefore, we can never know what that author meant. There is never a correct interpretation. All we can ever do with respect to any text is articulate what it means to me. What it means to me. Now, in fact, the deconstructionists go even further. Not only is it impossible for you ever to know the meaning of something that somebody else has written, the very person who wrote it can't know what it meant either. So you and I cannot know what Shakespeare meant, but neither can Shakespeare. Neither can Shakespeare. Now, this is...
Why?
This is intellectual suicide. Let's begin to find some nouns to describe this, because this has become the reigning approach to literature in America, in Western English departments. Can you imagine going to college and saying, I'm going to major in English? And that means I'm going to read all of the great literary work. I'm going to read Hemingway. I'm going to read Dante. I'm going to read Shakespeare. And then I'm going to have all of these brilliant professors tell me what these writers meant. And then you discover that you can't know. Now, it's not easy to refute It's not difficult to refute deconstructionism because, of course, the whole position reduces to nonsense. Because what we find is that you cannot communicate deconstructionism unless you forget deconstructionism in the process. Right? The people who teach deconstructionism assume that students can understand their meaning, that they are the exception to the rule. But that's the way it always is with relativists. Does the word deconstructionism describe the process of dismantling somebody's system of thought? No. I suppose we could use the word in that way, but it wouldn't be very helpful because it's become a technical term in modern academia. Deconstructionism means that all thought and all meaning is purely subjective, and there is no way to take your meaning and your ideas and give it to somebody else. All thought is that's what the precise label of deconstruction, how that precise label came about, I can't tell you that. But that's what it refers to. It doesn't refer to dismantling or blowing up or critiquing somebody else's theory. Because look, in order to critique Hegel, which I'll be doing next week, for example, you have to understand Hegel in the first place. See, if people said, obviously we can never completely understand the meaning of a text, that would be innocent. That would be rather trivial. That would be pretty obvious. That's certainly true with Scripture. To be a deconstructionist means you believe that you can never know anything about the meaning of a text. And of course, if that's true, then you can never know the meaning of any deconstructionist textbook either, can you? I don't want to repeat certain stories, but I only have a limited number of them, and I'm going to repeat a story that some of you have heard before. But it's worth telling. I met a lady who took a literature course from some university from a deconstructionist literature professor. And part of the course required them to read Moby Dick. And of course she's being told by the professor that nobody knows what Herman Melville meant. And there are a lot of symbols in Moby Dick. So she knew that on the exam she would have to write an essay about the meaning of Moby Dick from a deconstructionist point of view. So here's what she said to herself, because she didn't buy into this garbage, but she said to herself, I'm going to come up with the most stupid interpretation of Moby Dick I can think of, and just see what happens. So she went into the exam, and her first sentence was this: Moby Dick represents the Republic of Ireland. I swear to you, this is the truth. All right? And then she just went on from there. And she got an A. And this professor said, brilliant analysis. Brilliant. I have never read anything more brilliant about Moby Dick. And it was all a put-on from start to finish. Now, you get Diogenes Allen saying that deconstructionism, here, I'm looking, this first page of his article, there is a lot to be said for deconstructionism. Now think about that, all right? There is a lot to be said for a system that says you can never understand what anybody else is talking about. But its claims are too extreme. There is no moderate form of deconstructionism. Deconstructionism is an either or, it's an all or nothing position. Because if you simply say, we can't understand everything that people say, what's new about that? What's new about deconstructionism is its radicalness. We can never know anything of what people say. Deconstructionists often turn out to be social revolutionaries. And so what they do is they use these documents which of course now mean whatever they mean to you. They use these documents as a way of radicalizing their students and turning them into neo-Marxists. I wish, if I had known I was going to get into this, I'd have brought a copy of the Syracuse Alumni Magazine. I got my PhD at Syracuse. And remember, this is a fundraising quarterly from Syracuse University. And in the back of one of the issues that I've saved, they talk about new changes in the English department. We have dropped our usual approach to literature at Syracuse University. Now we're going to make great literature relevant in the form of such course titles as these. And I don't have the precise course titles, but this is close enough. Shakespeare's Writings and the Sandinista Revolution. I kid you not, all right? Or The Writings of Goethe and the Search for the Goddess. You see, it's all far-left, radical chic garbage that what it means is, if you're interested in becoming a revolutionary, you want to become an English professor. I'm serious. Because in the old days, you see, you could maybe become a political scientist or something else, but now you're no longer obligated to spend so much time talking about the meaning of these passages in Julius Caesar. You just have the students read it, and then you go off on your revolutionary harangue. It's magnificent. So you've got all of these Marxists who are trying to destroy Western civilization teaching English courses, literature courses. It's Deconstructionism. Okay. I spoke at a conference in the state of Washington a few weeks ago, and one of the speakers was a lady who teaches at a major university in the South. I will not get very specific here. If she ever hears the tape, she will know, and she knows I disagreed with her, all right, because we had several knockdown arguments over various things. She presented some pretty powerful arguments against radical environmentalists. I mean, she really did. And she's spitting out the facts and spitting out the information and really blowing these people down left and right. I mean, if there's such a thing as a spiritual machine gun, she had it. But then she combined this magnificent assault on the echo-wackos of the world, including Al Gore. She included with this magnificent assault on these environmental wackos a kind of cultural and cognitive relativism. I get this. For an hour now, we've watched her mow these people down, verbally, beautifully. And then, when she gets backed into a corner, as I happened to try to do on another issue, she took refuge in cognitive relativism. And here's what she said. Well, that's true for you, but it's not true for me. All right? Now, look at the insanity of this. If she started her presentation by saying, I'm a cognitive relativist, and all truths are relative, and all ideas are relative, no one in the audience would take anything she said seriously. Apparently, it never dawned on her, and still doesn't dawn on her, how that retreat to cognitive relativism cuts the ground out from underneath everything else she says. I'm going to urge you all, before this semester's over, to read the last few pages of Gordon Clark's Thales to Dewey. And here is an approximation of what he says on that last page. It's after he finishes with Dewey and relativism and Nietzsche and all of it. He says, wait a minute, this is not new. We've heard all of this before in the history of philosophy. In fact, he says, we're right back to where we were in the days of Socrates, with the ancient sophists. All you needed to bring ancient Athens up to date was the infusion of Oriental ideas vis-a-vis the New Age movement. This commitment to relativism, subjectivism. I'm going to the next time the history of philosophy class meets, I'm going to quote two ancient sophists. I'll quote them for you. Protagoras, who said, "Man is the measure of all things. All truth is relative." That's what Protagoras said. All truth is relative. And then another sophist came along named Gorgias, and he said, there ain't no truth. Now, he didn't say there ain't no truth. He said there isn't any truth. The outline of the modern of the contemporary postmodern age is present in ancient sophism. And then Gordon Clark says this: reflection on the propensity of a fallen human race to repeat old errors is something we should ponder more carefully. And perhaps if we spend time reflecting about this, it will postpone the day of our suicide a little bit further. Now, Gordon Clark was a Christian, and of course he wasn't advocating suicide. His point was that people without Christ who become conscious of of this continued return to fallen ideas from the past might easily conclude that this whole business is useless and worthless and meaningless. Why go through it another day? Why not just end it if we're just destined to repeat the errors of the past? Gordon Clark's message, even though he wouldn't appreciate being linked up with Kierkegaard, whom he saw as an enemy of Christianity, Gordon Clark's message is basically the message of Kierkegaard. The only way we can break out of this cycle is to recognize that God has given us revealed truth. We can know the truth after all. And it's when we turn our back on that revealed truth that God has given us that we damn and condemn ourselves to this kind of idiocy. But in the meantime, a lot of other people get damned because this idiocy works its way into the culture. So, read the last, you'd be wise to read the last 30 or 40 pages of Gordon Clark's Thales to Dewey. The bottom of page 232. No, actually, it was an hour ago that I started to read the first full paragraph on 232. To give a full definition of postmodernism is virtually impossible. But then he gives you some books. And notice, every one of these books is published after 1987. Nevertheless, it is possible to identify its leading general features insofar as it is likely to be encountered by the Christian apologist, especially in North America. This is the pre-commitment to relativism or pluralism in relation to questions of truth. To use the jargon of the movement, one could say that postmodernism represents a situation in which the signifier has replaced the signified as the focus of orientation and value. Now, may I explain that? Please do. I will. The signified refers to what is being said, what is being pointed to, the text, the communication, the message. The signifier is the person who gives meaning to those words or to those symbols. Often the signifier is the writer or the speaker, But in deconstructionism, the signifier is more often the listener, who creates whatever meaning those words have in his own consciousness. This puts the signifier ahead of the signified. That's what deconstructionism does. In terms of the structural linguistics developed initially by, I can't pronounce that guy's name. Anybody here can? And subsequently by Roman Jacobson and others, the recognition of the arbitrariness of the linguistic sign and its interdependence with other signs marks the end of the possibility of fixed absolute meanings. Thus, modern society was trapped in an endless network of artificial sign systems which meant nothing and merely perpetuated the belief systems of those who created them. And then he goes on to talk about deconstructionism, and one of the astounding discoveries of one of the founders of deconstructionism, and that is that he turned out to have been a Nazi. And there's a good possibility that he developed deconstructionism to sort of cover over, to nullify the consequences of his Nazi sympathies earlier in his life. Well, you can read about that. Now, McGrath goes on to challenge this relativism. He says, look, if truth is relative, if all values are relative, and here's where you really stick the knife into these people, then what are you going to do with Hitler and the Holocaust and Hindu funeral pyres? What are you going to do with a religious system that forces widows to lay down on a burial pyre and then set the whole thing alight, burning the poor widow to death? Are we to say nothing about those evils? If we condemn them, then we abandon our relativism. If we retain our relativism, then we lose all right to criticize such obvious evils. On the last paragraph on 234, McGrath says, the moral seriousness of this question often acts as the intellectual equivalent of a battering ram, bringing out the fact that certain views just cannot be allowed to be true. There must be some criteria, some standards of judgment which allow one to exclude certain viewpoints as unacceptable. Otherwise, postmodernism will be seen to be uncritical and naive, a breeding ground of the political and moral complacency which allowed the rise of the Third Reich back in the 1930s. Even postmodernism has difficulties in allowing that Nazism is a good thing. Well, you can read all of that for yourself, and that's basically what I want to get from McGrath's article. It just sort of serves as a complement to Allen's. All right, now, where are we? We need some kind of summary, but I'm going to avoid that summary because I wanted to just give you an idea of where we're heading. I want you to see how the modern age came to be, largely through the work of Kant and Hegel. Then I want you to see through this course how things began to fall apart, how we began to go down the tubes, and it didn't begin 20 years ago. And this is the beauty of Gordon Clark's study, as difficult as it is to appreciate sometimes. This didn't just begin 20 years ago. Western civilization started to go down the toilet, and you editors to the audio version can do what you wish with this particular section. But it began to go down the toilet early in the 1800s. And all kinds of things contributed to it. Not the least of which were these supposed demolitions of Christian theology based on the faulty assumptions of modernity. And again, I say, it's ironic, the way in which the major prophet of all of this turns out to have been the mad atheist named Friedrich Nietzsche.